My first job was writing photo cut lines and editing photos for the website. I wanted to write the best photo cut lines I possibly could. Never turned down an opportunity. My bosses came to me and said, I want you to do this. I always said yes. I'm just going to try to do it better than anybody else, more thoroughly and more comprehensively, quicker, and with no mistakes. If you can connect with somebody on a human level, build that rapport, build that trust with them, you're probably going to get them to open up a little bit easier.
What to you is the art of storytelling, and how can one properly develop that?
Way easier said than done. The number one trait.
Welcome back to 30 Years in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Michael Oved, and we've got a great episode for you today. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you today's guest. Ryan Hunt is the former co-editor-in-chief of Sports Illustrated, where he managed the magazine's editorial staff, leading a team of experienced reporters and editors and overseeing digital strategy, from daily content planning to major event coverage to franchise development. Hunt won a Sports Emmy in 2017 for outstanding digital innovation for his involvement on the Capturing Everest project, the first ever bottom-to-top climb of Mount Everest captured in virtual reality. Under his leadership, Sports Illustrated also launched multiple digital franchises, including the Daily Cover, their signature premium piece. Ryan is now a lecturer in the University of Florida's College of Journalism and Communications. Ryan, thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks, Michael. Happy to be here.
So we'll start off with your childhood, Ryan. What about your childhood? What about your upbringing piqued your interest in journalism, specifically in sports journalism?
Well, I grew up a big baseball fan. I grew up in the Tampa Bay area. So in those days, the Rays didn't exist. The Lightning didn't exist. It was just the Buccaneers down there. There's a lot of transplants in the state of Florida. So everybody was a fan of every different team. If you grew up in New York, you came down, you're probably still a Yankees and Mets fan. You grew up in Boston, you came down, you're still a Sox fan. My parents grew up in Chicago, so I was a Cubs fan. And, in those days, Wrigley Field didn't get lights until 1988. So like you'd come home from school every day and the Cubs are playing at 2:20 on WGN. It was like that was like my ritual is get off the bus, come in, play a little bit outside, and then watch the Cubs game. So like that connection with baseball was built really in my childhood. Played a lot of baseball growing up, and also collecting baseball cards. It's funny. That's where there's a lot of analytically driven sports journalists. Like baseball cards were our analytics back in the day. So, I lived and breathed stats. So knowing that, hey, Dwight Gooden went 24-4 in 1985, and Wade Boggs led the league in hitting in 86, and Andre Dawson on the Cubs, was the MVP in 87, hit with 49 homers. Like, you kind of lived stats through collecting baseball cards. So that was kind of my first entry into, or where my love affair with sports came. I read a lot. That's kind of where it all began and kind of manifested itself through my whole career.
And once you realized you were interested in journalism, in sports journalism in particular, how did you develop that skill?
Just trying to write. I mean, there was no internet like in those days. So really it was writing for either your high school paper or I was on both that and the yearbook. So I was the sports editor of our yearbook. I look back and actually reading some of the things that we wrote back in, they're just not good. They're pretty bad. And like anything, it's the more reps you get, the more practice you get, the more you read, like the better you get. That was the best way to try to approach it, because you couldn't just start your own personal blog or your own podcast. In those days, you really had to just try to write and read the paper as much as you could.
Wow. And I guess obviously, like anything else, at first, when you're first developing a skill, you're not good at it. And as you progress, as you develop it, you get better. For people who are your age, around the time when you discovered your interest in journalism, what advice would you give them if at first they're not a good writer, but they're interested in journalism?
It just takes reps. Even for professional journalists. One of my close friends is Andrea Adelson at ESPN. I had her into my class on Tuesday just to talk about her career trajectory. And I was curious about how she got into on-camera work. Because that was a kind of a lesson for some of our students. We weren't even thinking about that when we were in college. We were just writing. But even for her, in as she got into ESPN, she was saying that, they asked me to do some on-air spots, and I had no training. They just kind of put me in front of a camera and said, do it. And I was terrible. And like, I couldn't get I wasn't getting it much actionable feedback, so I think it in all stages of this business, it's just really trying to understand how to reach an audience, looking at how other people are doing. I've personally looked at other journalists, see how they approach their jobs, the questions they were asking, how they structured their stories, seeing what the questions I asked and reading what their end product was, seeing, okay, well, here's how he asked that question, here's the response he got, and here's how he structured the story within it. So I was, afforded the opportunity to be able to watch some really good journalists at UF. So that kind of was a benefit that I didn't really even realize at the time. But like I was saying, for anything, it's just doing it, like just trying to practice and get reps, whether you're writing, whether you're recording your own podcast, whether you're trying to get on camera or work, you're going to get better with reps. And also knowing how to take feedback, because sometimes the feedback in this industry can be harsh, can be rough. You have to have a thick skin and but also have a drive internally to say, okay, well, if that was terrible, I'm going to try to figure out a way I'm going to make it better.
You mentioned your time at UF, and I know in college you wrote for the independent Florida Alligator. For those in college now, what do you think is the best way to prepare them for a career in journalism?
We tell this to our students all the time, like, get involved, just get in the mix. Like, I would not trade my experience at the Alligator for anything. I had a chance to work with some really great people on the staff there. I mean, many of the people at the Alligator when I was there went on to do great things in this industry. Andy Staples, I mentioned Andrew Adelson, Mark Long writes for the AP, Israel Gutierrez is on, what was that, that ESPN show? He's an analyst on ESPN. Andy Staples, like, the list goes on and on. Like, how at the same time, we were also getting to watch. This is when I was in school, Florida was one of the best college football programs in the nation. So there was numerous journalists covering everything about Florida football. Gatesville Sun was there every day, the AP, St. Pete Times, Orlando Sentinel, Jacksonville Times Union, national journalists, all wanting to ask Spurrier any question they could and get any morsel you could from the football program. So like I was saying in the last question, I watched a lot of how those journalists approached their business, how they asked questions, when they asked questions, what were the right questions to ask, studied like their behavior in press conferences and in one-on-one settings. That was how we were trying to approach it. But don't also wait. Like, I think one thing that hiring managers look at, that's one thing that I looked at when I was hiring either interns or entry level staffers was did you make the most of your time at college? I know a lot of people, it can be a balance between, trying to get good grades and doing all the extracurricular activities and just having fun. College, they say, is the best 4 years of your life. And, but also there's a way you can make the most of it, professionally. And that's one thing that I actually didn't even start in the Alligator until my third year. I waited a little bit. However, I stayed an extra year because I wanted to try to get as many opportunities as I could. Florida was also, like I said, they won a national championship in '96, so I stayed until to cover the '97 season. They were going to be number one again, so there's no better beat to cover. I actually hope to parlay that into a full-time job.
The beautiful part of the story is just that you didn't start working at the Alligator until later. And that really is just a testament to the fact that it's never too late.
It is never too late.
There's so many students at college who come into college, they're juniors, they're sophomores, even seniors. And they say, I'm not involved with journalism. I have a passion for it, but it's too late for me to pursue it. What would you tell them?
It's never too late. I actually have a printout of a framed copy of the first article I wrote for the Alligator. It is from March of '95. It was on a Florida baseball player. It was just a feature article that they assigned it to me. And I was like, I'm going to make the most of this. I'm going to try to tell the best story about Jack Item I could possibly find. I called his dad. His dad listened to all of his games on the radio. And I was like, I wanted to try to make an impression with that. We try to encourage our students to get involved in many different ways that they can, because in this industry, you have to be versatile and you have to show that you can do more than one thing, whether that's being good on camera, being able to host your own show, or whether it's on audio or a podcast, and being able to write. And those are the common denominator for the three, but versatility is so important. So that's what I'm telling our students is like, you've got to try to be as versatile as possible, but also make the most of every opportunity and don't shy away from a challenge.
And so you graduated from the University of Florida, 1997. You got a degree in journalism. And then in 1998, you started at Sports Illustrated. How and why did you get a job there?
It was a little bit of luck. Number one, like I said, I was hoping to get a job at the Bradenton Herald. That was my goal. I thought, I was like, I've covered the football team for them. It's a no-brainer. They kind of drug their heels and like, oh yeah, we got a role, but we're waiting for approval from corporate, blah, blah, blah. And at the same time, this is when digital was also starting to emerge. Almost all of my Alligator colleagues went print, went into newspapers. CNNSI launched at the end of 1997. So they were still building out their staff, entry level. They were looking for people just to help build out their website. I didn't know anything about it. What I learned in college and what I ended up doing for my first job were two completely different things. My first job was writing photo cut lines and editing photos for the website. And these photos were the size of like postage stamps, right? I spent 3 years of the Alligator busting my ass trying to, to find a beat job. And I ended up doing something completely different. Having said that, I also wanted to try to bet on myself and get in at the ground floor of a prestigious organization. So I was working in the CNN Center. We were collaborating with the people at CNN Sports and also with the group in New York at the magazine. They were still trying to figure out what their digital strategy was too. In the late 90s, how many people had to figure it out? And I think if a lot of people had to do it over again, they would do things very differently given what we've seen over the last 25 years. But I wanted to bet on myself and try to take a chance in a role that I thought was emerging. And not that I was thinking that print was going to do what it was over the next 2 decades, but I was like, this is a cool opportunity. Let me get in on the ground floor and try to make the most of it. It was entry level, so we were all starting at basically the same place within the organization. So it also gave me the opportunity to try to make a name for myself.
What would you do all over again?
No, I'm saying what the industry would do all over again. I think the industry, like giving everything away for free at the beginning of the internet, kind of set the course for where we are now in the industry. Everybody expects to get journalism for free, or especially on the web. Everybody would happily pay for a Sports Illustrated magazine, or you're paying for, today you're paying for Netflix and Hulu and Peacock and Paramount. But for great journalism, people are still unwilling to support journalism outside of maybe they like stories like The Athletic. But I think if everybody who was a decision maker had to go back in time, they would have made a more concerted effort to actually try to monetize content on the internet a lot more aggressively than they did. Because by giving away for free for so long, everybody just expects it. And here we are trying to make hay on an ad supported model, which isn't working for almost anybody right now.
And so going back to you're starting off at Sports Illustrated, your first job there was an associate producer. You spoke a bit about that. And then you worked your way up to become editor-in-chief. What did you do that set you apart from the rest of the people you were working with, from your colleagues? And how do you recommend that other people do the same thing?
Never turn down an opportunity. So if my bosses came to me and said, I want you to do this, I always said yes. Didn't matter what it was. Because the one time, if you get a reputation for for saying no to things, they're going to stop asking. Like I said, my first job was editing photo cut lines. It was writing photo cut lines and working in Photoshop and adding photos to the stories. I wanted to write the best photo cut lines I possibly could. I'm like going to research stats. I'm going to try to find, and like I said, mind you, these things were that big at the time. It's not like these giant images that they're beautiful that are top of stories now. Even on mobile, like they're much bigger than they were back in the day. But like the approach that I had was always say yes to every opportunity, and then even if they asked me to do grunt work, I was gonna do it. I was just talking to one of the GMs in the G League at the College Park Skyhawks. His name's Dan Starkman. He was actually a former team manager on the University of Florida basketball team. And he told me the story about if Billy Donovan asked me to mop the floor, I was going to mop the floor as best as I could. I'm going to make this shiniest floor you could possibly have. And I kind of had that same mindset of I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to try to do it better than anybody else here could. And I was competitive in my own right. So not that I was saying that I was better than anybody else, but I wanted to try to do the job more thoroughly and more comprehensively, quicker, and with no mistakes. So that was going to be something that the higher ups noticed. I then went on to I was the homepage editor for a decade. That is where I really learned about audience behavior, just the stories that worked, the headlines that worked, how photos made a difference, understanding how a user thinks, little tweaks that you can make to potentially get them to be interested in a story. Like that's where I learned. I think that this is the one thing that really made the biggest difference for me is having an understanding of what a sports fan is going to gravitate to and click on the internet.
So then what is the key to getting readers to be interested in the story? What's the key to grabbing their attention, to crafting a story that they're going to want to read?
We try to make it actionable for our readers, like not just for people who are sports fans. One of the things that I would always kind of ask is, hey, would my mom be interested in this story? Like, she doesn't like sports. Is this a headline and or story concept that would resonate with someone who isn't, like, if it's using the Knicks example, like all Knicks fans are going to be looking for that. But how can you make an SEC fan care about a Big Ten story? How do you make somebody who loves the Patriots care about the Seahawks head coach or what's happening in the NFC South? Sometimes it's just really about trying to focus on a point within it that you think is like, okay, well, this was interesting. It really encapsulate what the entirety of the thing is, whether it's one specific quote or one specific theme. If you have 15 seconds to tell me what this podcast, what this story is about, what are you going to tell them? If you can't tell them in 15 seconds, it's probably not a good story. If you can, make sure that your headline or the way you're selling it incorporates and encapsulates that element, whether it's humor, emotion, things you can learn. All of those things are elements that help drive curiosity.
So it's really just a matter of understanding your audience. It's a matter of tailoring the headline to what they want to see and giving them an actionable item, something that'll really excite them.
Yeah. I tell people all the time, you need to look at sports media not as just as somebody who is interested in the media side of it. Put yourself in the shoes of a fan, of somebody who's looking for this content. Where would you look for it? If you're searching for something, on Google and you can't find something about it, maybe it's an interesting story. Like curiosity and understanding. We look like I said, this kind of plays into like the baseball card story, but like looking back at the back of baseball cards to see stats, like we would look at the stats element kind of shaped how I approached our journalism. Like, here's where and when and how people were reading this story. 56% of it came at after 6 p.m., meaning, okay, they wanted to sit back and read. They're not going to be reading it during their workday. That also helps kind of shape when and how we were sharing the story. Like, if, okay, maybe let's push this one on weekends because it's a longer read and more people have time to lean back and kind of dig into a weightier, heavier story, as opposed to something that's more news driven that speed is a factor. So yeah, understanding the audience and kind of digging into the data helped us kind of formulate our plan for how we were approaching everything that we were doing.
Beyond the headlines, as editor-in-chief, you've seen many journalists, you've mentored many journalists, you've encountered many of them. What is the biggest mistake you see young journalists make? And what is the biggest mistake you think young people make when they're first coming into a company?
Trying to find the perfect opportunity and saying no. Get your foot in the door somewhere. It's easier to find a job when you already have one, by and large. But if you're going to wait to try to, like, if you're a student and saying, well, I love baseball and I want to make sure I stay in the Southeast and I want to cover the majors, that leaves 3 jobs essentially, or 3 markets, I should say, that you're painting yourself into a very, very limited corner, right? So I think the biggest mistake that people make is trying to be too fine with their search, but also, as I mentioned, when you get in the door, saying no to opportunities. Like, you have to take every opportunity when your boss is asking you something to jump onto a story, because you never know what it could be. Here's a good example of that. When I was a correspondent for the Orlando Sentinel in college, my boss at the time, Chris Harry, when you were a correspondent, you usually had to do things that the main beat writers didn't want to do. You had to go to practice every day. You had to run quotes. You had to do all the grunt work. But sometimes it was also covering things that, the beat writers like, you go do it. I've got other things on my plate. So they signed me to cover Gator Nationals, which is a NHRA top fuel funny car racing circuit. I knew absolutely zero about it, less than nothing. But I wasn't going to turn it down. I was like, okay, well, I got to figure out, one, like, what am I going to do? Like, I have no idea who any of these people are. I don't know their stories. I don't know how it works. I don't know what the format for any of the tournament, for any of the racing. It's not like the Indy 500 where you're driving around with 500 laps, and that's an easy concept. An NHRA event is a lot. There's a structure, there's formats. But I started doing a little bit of research. One of the things I noticed was Larry Nance was on the roster of drivers. Larry Nance was the 1984 Slam Dunk champion. So I was like, well, that's weird. Like, for one, like, how did Larry Nance, who used to play for the Cavs and the Phoenix Suns, like, get into NHRA racing? And he's 6'10". Like, how did somebody like who's 6'10" even fit into one of these top fuel funny car machines? They've built a very specific way for him. I mean, it was basically like, if you've seen some of those commercials about like George Mirasan, who's 7'7", and trying to fit into one of those smart cars. It was exactly like that. He's just kind of all wedged in. Even like small drivers are kind of wedged in, but just the whole, so the curiosity about, like, oh, how does this even work? So I went there, and that was the story I wrote from Gator Nationals. Sometimes when an opportunity presents itself, you never know. Even if you know nothing about it, embrace it with your arms wide open. You never know what you're going to get, and you might even have something that turns out 30 years later to be a memorable story that you can cite about how you approached your job. So that's kind of one of the things that I say to students about how not to make a mistake, is just embrace every opportunity, because you never know when you might not get the next one.
And I think that's a wonderful theme, really, that you've had throughout your career, is just never say no. Never say no. And I like to say that this year is the year of yes, and every year should always be a year of yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, I'll couch that by saying you don't want to be taken advantage of, but it also, like, you want to just develop a reputation to be someone who's reliable and who'll go after it and try to be curious and creative about the way they approach it. Like, will do the best job that they can. If you can develop that reputation, which is how I think I emerged throughout and grew at SI, Like you're going to be asked to do more things. You're going to be given more responsibility. If they see you can handle it, then that with that becomes more responsibility, and that's how you grow. It also might, you never know who you might run into on the outside. You could make an impression on somebody else who's, from another organization who's at that, at a game or event that sees how you're handling your business, reads the work you do and says, oh, that's a name I need to keep track of. And, if we have an opportunity to hire down the road, that's somebody I might be interested in. That happens for me all the time when I was in a hiring position. I would see how people approach their work and kind of, work ethic is the hardest thing to see from a resume. It's not palpable. So, but when you're watching people in the field and how they handle their business and how they approach assignments or shy away from them, that's when you get to see, who potentially is somebody you might be to looking to bring into your organization.
I think beyond that, and this is something we spoke a lot about with Nancy Gibbs, the former editor-in-chief of Time magazine, journalism is all about storytelling. Success is all about storytelling. It's about pitching yourself. It's about pitching your story and letting the world see for themselves who you are. What to you is the art of storytelling, and how can one properly develop that skill?
I mean, I think the number one trait that all journalists should have is curiosity, right? So if you have that, to find the stories that aren't being told, that's a very tough. That's way easier said than done. Is trying to get at the crux of what's a good story. So I think that's the challenge, right? Like not just knowing how to find a good story, but an interesting way to tell it. How this is where interviewing comes into play. Like the best interviewers are really good listeners. A story that we told at SI that was really impactful was the one about Sean Bradley, the former 76er center, 7'6". He got into a bike crash in Colorado and now is spending the rest of his life in a wheelchair. So he's a paraplegic. And how even a person who's 7'6" tries to function without in a wheelchair. It's that just the logistics of that is complicating. So but then also being able to get Sean to open up and kind of tug on those heartstrings. I think the best stories in sports are really the ones that are either funny or emotional or you learn something. We've always told people to take people where they can't go or tell them what they don't know. So how do you do that? That's where that's where the science of journalism comes into play. And I think it starts with, like I said, curiosity, being a good interviewer, and then listening. Those three attributes will actually probably open the doors to more stories that are worth telling that you might not even know about.
I think even going beyond journalism, life is all about pitching yourself. It's all about telling the story of yourself. Do those traits also apply to the art of storytelling within our general lives beyond journalism? And how can we properly pitch ourselves to other people, tell our story to other people? What is the best way to do that?
So you really have to sell yourself. If you can't sell yourself, how are you going to be able to sell your stories, right? So it starts with that, the confidence. You have to have that innate confidence to be able to go up to somebody, look them directly in the eye and say, hey, this is what I can do. This is some of the work that I've already done. This is what I can bring to your organization. When you are in the role of being able to tell stories, if you can connect with somebody on a human level, build that rapport, build that trust with them, you're probably going to get them to open up a little bit easier than you would if you're just coming in hot and just saying, hey, tell me about blank. And you ask kind of a general question that leads to a really non-specific answer and you go nowhere, right? So I think the other factor that I think is really important for any journalist is empathy. But having that goes a long way, whether you're, in a newsroom as a leader, or if you're trying to find ways to connect with someone you want to tell their story and building that trust.
And so based on all of your successes, all of your experience, if you were speaking to somebody right now who wants to be successful in journalism, successful in life, successful in any area of the world, what would you tell them?
But you have these conversations every day now, and this is what I love about it. This is why I actually got back into teaching. I never taught before. It was something that I wanted to. It was a wild career change, but I think the one thing about being an editor in chief is I was doing less of the actual hands-on journalism, more of the P&Ls and all the and the big picture strategy. I like the getting my hands on dirty and working with people, and that's what appealed to me about this role at UF. So like we get those questions all the time, like what do I need to do? It's confidence, it's betting, knowing how and when to bet on yourself, but also making sure this is not a 9 to 5 profession. Like if you want to do that, go work at a bank. You have to be willing to grind in the corners. You never know when your phone will ring, and you got to be ready and able to jump on something at a moment's notice. The other thing that we're telling everybody, all our students, is to know how to write on deadline. like like you got to be really clean, succinct, like prioritize your story, whether you're in journalism, whether you're in public relations, whether you're in television. Like if you can write clean, you can write fast, and you can be accurate, those traits will resonate beyond just journalism.
And so on to the rapid fire questions. What is your favorite and what is the best rivalry in sports?
Well, as a Florida person, am I contractually obligated to say Florida, Georgia, Florida State? I actually think it's Auburn, Alabama. I think that's because there's the pure hate that comes for those. They're poisoning trees. I don't, not that I condone that, but like Auburn, Alabama, like in terms of there's no pro sports in the state of Alabama. You are either one side, you're either crimson or you're orange and blue, and there's nothing else. So I think there's, I mean, obviously Duke, Carolina, and I tend to lean to the college rivalries more so than the pro ones, just because it's deep seated and franchises and the pros can get vary in quality. And if like Bears Packers, like great rivalry, like, but it's never going to have like the same pomp and circumstance that a college football rivalry has. Having said that, I love the if you have never been to to Jacksonville, to the world's largest outdoor cocktail party, I highly recommend it. It's one of the most unique games in sports because it's half red and black, half orange and blue. It's a spectacle. Same thing with Texas, Oklahoma, which has the same kind of vibe. Those are the unique ones. And I hope that with all of these realignments and the way conferences are expanding, that college football doesn't lose its soul, which is the rivalries, which is games like this. That's what makes college football great, in my opinion. And I hope that college football doesn't lose that.
I mean, as a Harvardian, I like to think the Harvard-Yale rivalry is.
Yeah, that's another great one. Yeah, like, and I think if you have passion, and there's that kind of like we're just better than them. Like there's so many of them. I think that like I said, that's what makes college sports great. I don't think you get that in Lakers Celtics or any of the other like professional rivalries. Yeah, like there's probably a little bit of Rangers Islanders, like college football for me, college sports for me.
And so what is your favorite and least favorite sports team?
I grew up in Tampa, so I've followed the Buccaneers the longest. They were terrible when I was growing up. It was, it was either 2-14, and with the year the years they got to 6-10 were good years. So that's the team I've followed the closest. I mean, not being at UF, like I'm obviously helping students cover all of the University of Florida sports teams, and it's not what it was when I was a student, that's for sure, especially in football. But yeah, like I think I tend to watch the Tampa teams closest. A big Liverpool fan. I have a close friend of mine is in their international development department. So we've over the past 10, 15 years or so, we've Like that's been a big part of like our relationship. And I got to go to the Champions League final when Liverpool played Spurs in Madrid. So those were like really cool experiences. And like I said, as least favorite team, as a University of Florida alum and a faculty member, I'm contractually obligated to say either Georgia or Florida State.
What is your biggest regret?
I don't have one. I don't think. I always tell like people to focus on what they can control, and like that's the kind of the mantra I live by. I can't go back and change anything. I don't live with regrets. I bogeyed number 18 today. That kept me from shooting under 80 for the first time. So maybe I'll go with that. Like bogeying 18 this morning.
Got it. And what book do you recommend?
The one I'm reading right now is a book called Intangibles by Joan Ryan. She was one of the first female columnists in the country. She worked for the San Francisco Examiner. Joan is going to be inducted into the UF Hall of Fame, UF Sports CJC Ring of Honor. So it's our sports Ring of Honor, along with George Solomon, who is the former sports editor of the Washington Post, and Red Barber, who was one of the iconic baseball announcers from the Yankees back in the mid 50s. So Joan, her most recent book is on the psychology of a locker room. So like I always find that fascinating too, is like just how locker rooms tick. You always hear about like, oh, this person's going to be a problem for the locker room. That's why we don't need to add this, somebody of this who has bad attitude or something like that. Just how the psychology of locker rooms tick. So that's one that I'm reading right now. Favorite book of all time? Just depends on the day, I guess.
And what is the quote that you live by?
So that scene in The Office where Michael Scott's got it on the board, like you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Wayne Gretzky, Michael Scott, like. So it's that with the Michael Scott flair to it, but it's true. That's one of the things that we tell young writers all the time. You literally miss 100% of the shots you don't take. If you're saying no to something, you never know what could have come from it. So yeah, Michael Scott.
By the way, is my favorite TV show of all time, The Office. The last question is, what is your fondest sports memory?
Well, I've had the good fortune of seeing my alma mater win a national championship in person for the first time in both football, the 96 national championship when they beat Florida State, and basketball when they won in 2006 against UCLA. Got a chance to cover 7 Super Bowls, go to the Masters. The coolest thing I've ever seen was I got to be at game 162 when the Rays rallied to beat the Yankees and make the playoffs on the last day of the season in the 13th. And they homered with 2 outs in the 9th to tie the game. They rallied from 7-0 deficit in the 8th inning. Dan Johnson homered with 2 outs in the 9th. And then Evan Longoria hit the 315-foot little line drive over the short wall at Tropicana Field to knock out, the Red Sox from the playoffs, and the Rays made the wild card. That was 2011. I was like one of the coolest things I've ever had a chance to be at. I think that's a memory that I got to go with my dad, and that's a memory that I'll have forever.
As a Yankees fan, I don't know if that makes me too excited, but
the Yankees had already made the playoffs that year. This was for the last wild card, so it knocked the Red Sox out of the playoffs. But yeah, and the Rays at that time too weren't on the run like they've been now, where they make the playoffs consistently pretty much over the last few years. In 2011, they weren't making the playoffs that regularly. It was a rarity. So it was like the special moment of seeing an epic comeback, last game of the season, plus making the playoffs for one of the rare times in franchise history. That was awesome.
I mean, knocking the Red Sox out, you got me. This has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. Thank you again for your time, Ryan. Your words of advice and your trajectory of your career has been so inspirational. So we really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Michael. I had fun.
Of course. Thank you for listening to 30 Years in 30 Minutes. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments if there's anyone else you want to hear from.